So rich in historical facts, my presentation is going to look maybe light-hearted at best. But anyway, hi everybody, my name is Chee. If some of you are my Facebook friends, you know me better as Meng. And physically it's the same person, but I'm one person who is a firm believer that a person can always have more than one social or cultural identity. So, okay, that's another apology to make. I'm not like a natural born public speaker. So, and I always get very nervous if I try to read from a script. So what I do is I just rely a lot on visuals. So if you don't seem to follow what I'm saying, just try to look at PowerPoint and follow. Okay, yeah, maybe just get back to that. Yeah, so my title is Heritage in Singapore, Performance of Identities or Knowledge of the Past. I sort of came up with this title because I think that a lot of times people talk about heritage as being important because of the meaning it holds for our identity and as a nation or as an ethnic group and so on. But it's also complicates the matters because history is not so simple as how it seems to be presented through cultural heritage. So I'll start with what I call, maybe not myths, but I'll call them misconceptions in Singapore about heritage. Okay, maybe you start with this picture. This is from a newspaper report just last weekend. Okay, it's the National Day special, and it says, "Turn back the clock." We take a look at Singaporeans' growing sense of nostalgia, and behind it, of course, is a picture of the National Theatre, which we lost in the 1980s. So when you look at a report like this, immediately you think, okay, this is heritage and this is nostalgia. And the two words, heritage and nostalgia, seem to merge in one. We conflate them as one. And maybe it is not all propaganda, maybe, but I think like when we have such reports, it's very convenient for the state because we would hear maybe a minister saying that, well, heritage is about memory, the next generation will create its own memory, so it just goes on. Maybe you know which minister that is, but so we seem to think that, okay, heritage is just something old, and it can maybe be a hindrance to progress because like we need to live lives, it's like so. Of course, maybe the facilities at National Theatre may be old, and we need a newer theatre. But that how do you negotiate with the memory? There are a lot of questions. Okay, a second second myth or misconception is that cultural heritage in Singapore is basically the sum of the CMIO identity. So it's like, okay, you have Chinese heritage, Malay, Indian heritage, and then you add together, you have like four. Right. I don't know what others mean. Usually people assume it's Eurasian. So if you have you need to represent four identities, you just get someone to do Eurasian dance. Maybe it's like you invite somebody from Portugal, maybe to choreograph. Seriously, this has been done. So we forget that, of course, through the interaction of different communities in Singapore, there's also some local kind of culture. It's not that we can only have Chinese or Indian culture that will be thousands of years old, and therefore you need Chinese talents and Indian talents to come here and give us the original like Chinese Indian cultures in their true accents, right? Okay, a third myth is this idea that what qualifies as world heritage must be national heritage representing a common identity. So it is, I think, of course, when we think of Singapore as a nation, we want social cohesion. So it is important to let people understand history. But world heritage is a different story. Okay, so maybe I will start now. I go on to what this idea of world heritage is. Actually, it came about in 1972 in a World Heritage Convention. Within this convention, actually, there are two concepts. One is cultural heritage, another is natural heritage. So, well, cultural heritage, of course, we can easily understand. It's like, pyramids, or say the Palace and Garden of Versailles in France. Natural heritage refers to, well, say, certain landscapes, geological formations and so on. They are of interest to fossils and so on, that of interest to natural societies. And then in 2003, UNESCO came out with another convention for intangible heritage. So we have things like, say, oral traditions, festivals, and handicrafts and so on. But of course, this heritage, when we talk about heritage in this sense, it is definitely not just nostalgia or memory. It is that people come up with some kind of legal instruments so that something can be protected. And a very important concept, especially for cultural heritage, is this idea of authenticity, right? You don't, let me think of an example. You don't tear down a certain building and then make it totally different and then say, oh, but it's still the same building, but when everything has changed, right? And this framework in UNESCO, I mean, you can still criticize it, of course. It does not exhaust all the possibilities, because there are other possible ways of discussing heritage, like indigenous knowledge, for example. Knowledge relating to the use of plants, how people live in natural environment and so on. So, but basically, the heritage, in this sense, is about certain approach to keep what we think is important to society. And you may want to keep in mind also in 1972, that was also the time when there was Stockholm Conference, because in the 1960s there was concern about the deterioration of our natural environment with economic growth and urban development and so on. So actually, this natural heritage and cultural heritage convention also reflected that concern, except that it became more concerned with like historical and aesthetic values. So it tends to benefit more tourism than other things, right? Okay, another perspective on heritage is that of heritage studies. Okay, the traditional idea of heritage studies would be like somebody who is doing kind of applied science. Like I maybe imagine that, okay, I call myself a heritage expert because I work for a museum or whatever, and if you have a piece of antique at home, you just show me and then I can take a look at it and say, oh, okay, this maybe this vase dates back to the Ming dynasty, and then you can look at the make and then or the painting, like is it genuine and so on, and then I think it is worth about a few millions or whatever, and so on. Okay, or you look at the building and say, oh, this building, well, is important because like so and so lived here, and so it's like that's the traditional or older um, kind of heritage studies expert. The more recent perspectives in heritage studies in the last, say, 20 years or so is maybe a bit more complicated than that, because we would look at how people relate to heritage. So, maybe I'll just cite this book called Users of Heritage, written in 2006 by one Laura Jane Smith from Australia. So she wrote that there is really no such thing as heritage. Blah, blah. What she means is that we have to question this common sense assumption that heritage can unproblematically be identified as old, grand, monumental, and aesthetically pleasing sites, buildings, places, and artifacts. And instead, she says that heritage is what discourse. And when she says that, okay, I have to qualify, it doesn't mean that, therefore, okay, heritage is just like a social construction, right? So you can have your idea of heritage, and I can have my own idea, and in the end, it doesn't matter. I'm saying this because I remember at a time when there was discussion about Bukit Brown. Some people are saying, oh no, Bukit Brown is just like maybe heritage for a small group of people. It's maybe only the Chinese and not even every Chinese, and then it's only certain pioneers. It's like, and then somebody will comment, oh, heritage is all constructed, so never mind. And when you go into that kind of argument, it's like the nihilist kind of argument. Then, like, okay, nothing is worth saving, so we don't need to think about any value at all, right? So what she's actually saying in this book is that there is a hegemonic discourse about heritage, especially heritage that is defined according to Western elite cultural values that dismisses or disregards the perspectives of say societies in other parts of the world. We'll look at some examples later. So okay, I'm going to be very brief on this, but basically I just want, with this slide, I just want to show that there are a lot of different meanings associated with heritage. Like, physically it can be architecture or artifact or sites or memories. It can be cultural practices, like I mentioned, intangible stuff, and of course heritage is not just about the physical thing, but also about the values or meanings you associate with it. It can be representation of identity, and it's not even just about the physical thing and what you imagine it means, but the question is how you use it, right? If you use a place, go to a place as a tourist, is different from what you do if you go there as, say, say a family member or a clan member associated with the site, for example. So we have to always negotiate with different perspectives. And of course, like I said, when I talk about natural heritage, do we just want to talk about like beautiful mountains, beautiful rivers, or do we argue that, say, in the 21st century, what we should protect as our heritage is maybe the entire planet Earth, like what we can do to save it, right? So, this heritage discourse is a discourse of our values, social values, as maybe not just a community, maybe not just as a nation, but as the entire human race. Conflict. So, for example, I have this picture of chimes here. So, to some people, okay, we want to keep this heritage and use it. You can have nice dining there, or you can have a nice beer there. And then, but of course, if you have certain kind of youth dancers then, and maybe some people will not be happy, right? Because it used to be a common school. And then this picture of some relief sculpture in the Old Samyang grave in Bukit Brown. So it depicts, one of the 24 filial piety stories. It's actually about a filial son who tasted his father's excretion. So to find out what his ailment is. So to some people they may think, oh, this is just old stuff. Like if I don't believe in such stories, then this is like, oh, this is just shit to me. Oh sorry, pardon my language. I mean, I think we need to think a bit more sophisticated about these things. Like it's not just social values associated with it, it's also artistic value. You can still admire a piece of art, even if you do not share the same social belief or religious belief, right? So that author I just cited just now, Laura Jane Smith, she coined this term authorized heritage discourse to argue that I think some people don't like such terms, but yeah, okay. What she meant is it's always about a struggle of like contestation of what is important. So she actually criticized, for example, the UNESCO discourse of heritage, because she says that it is based on this European idea, 19th century idea of heritage, that heritage should be something that's monumental. For example, the Cologne Cathedral in Germany, or Notre Dame in Paris, and so on. And she says that if you look at other cultures, for example, in the case she researches on Aborigines in Australia, then their idea of heritage may be places of memory, this idea of dreamland, right? So she should argue that heritage in this sense can be understood as a kind of cultural tool for the performance and negotiation of identities and values. I think it is a very interesting perspective, because if you think about the struggle we have now in Singapore, in a way it is this issue of authorized heritage discourse, because, like, say, the government wants to nominate the Singapore Botanic Gardens as World Heritage, right? It's like, and if you look at the nomination, it sort of compares this garden to, say, the Kew Gardens in the UK, or some other landscape gardens in Europe, and so on, other gardens. So it's like, okay, this is how the Europeans imagine or understand as heritage. So we need to, like, meet that standard. But then the local community may have a different idea of what is heritage. In this case, the recent concern would be the Bukit Brown Cemetery, right? So I think the example of Singapore Botanic Gardens is also interesting when we look at what another scholar has said about heritage. Actually, there's this book by Ashworth and, not just Ashworth, but a few more writers. They talk about how there are different models for governing of heritage in different countries. There can be assimilation models. Say, for example, it can be France, or say a melting pot model, which may be in America, USA. And in Singapore, they describe it as an example of the core plus model. Just read this. Like this, where a plural society adopts a leading culture which is not the culture of the majority, or indeed even that of any of diverse cultural groups involved, just to use it as a convenient bargaining mechanism. I think it is, it may simplify things a lot, but then it is, in a way, it's a very fitting description, because it's like, think about it, we have been in the British colony, and like in maybe 1 or 2 generations ago, our lingua franca would be Malay, Hokkien, but now it's basically English, right? Why am I even speaking English to all of you now? Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's due to our history. And why, for example, Raffles Hotel was like held up as like a national heritage, you know, above other things. So it's very natural because we think, okay, if you only have, say, if you say Bukit Brown Cemetery is national heritage, maybe like non-Chinese may not be happy, or you say this Jalan Kubor is national heritage, like, well, again, some people may not be happy. So the safest bet, in a way, like to please people, we assume is to have British European heritage, so that, you know, it's fair, right? Everybody, any other CMIO heritage takes second place, so it's fair. Somebody has something to say. And on the second level, then we have this CMIO, as I was saying. So that's why I think in the 1980s, people came up with conservation areas, Chinatown, Kampung Glam, Little India. And the thing is, when we call this place Chinatown, actually it's like Greater Aya, or in Chinese we call New Zhesui or Cantonese Lao Jie Shui. It is not just the Chinese identity, it's like to what people remember it for is actually as a Cantonese enclave. It's special. Otherwise, like Chinese are like more than 70% of Singapore, right? But like it's Chinatown everywhere. Come on. So yeah. So we are in a way just creating these places so that people feel that you can go there to experience Chineseness or Indianness or whatever, right? Similarly, ethnic dances as what you may want to call intangible heritage has been used to perform this kind of CMIO identity. So around 1960 or so, there were like Aneka Ragam Rakyat, when like different ethnic music and dance groups would be sent to perform the kampongs around Singapore. And then when Singapore became independent, whenever some foreign dignitaries come to have kind of you know, formal dinner, they would have like different dance groups, you know, entertaining their Istana. So it's okay. So you feel, and of course the National Day Parade. So you feel that, okay, we can tell the world that we are multiracial, and then of course every community in Singapore is supposed to be happy. Like we are represented, more or less, right? Of course, it can be a bit more creative. I think last week is like, for example, you see that you don't really see Chinese, Malay, Indian dance. You saw them like same group doing different like songs, national songs, and then sometimes you do a bit of what looks like Indian dance, whatever. Right? Okay. Okay, talking about dance. I'm going to cite the example of Indian dance because it's actually one form that I'm more familiar with. Okay, Indian dance is like has in the 20th century has become a very important marker for the Indian diaspora around the world. Or at least the Hindu Indians, like South Indians, because in a way it reflects Hindu identity, when it, you know, so some family who live abroad, and then they have, when their daughter is growing up, they say, okay, go and study Indian dance, and then you perform, and then you invite all the family and friends to watch, you know, just when she's like 20 or maybe 20 something before she gets married. And then, you know, everybody feels like, you know, see, she is like, she embodies the Indianness on stage. Right? And then they will talk about, you know, this Indian dance culture dates back to not just 2,000 years. 2,000 years ago, there was this saint who wrote this treatise in Sanskrit, Natya Shastra, you know, so yeah, they would say that it dates back to that time, and then not only that, you know, the Lord Shiva was a dancer and so on, and all these stories. In a way, that it is true that the Indian dance tradition is very long. Like if you look at some classic, there's a classic in Tamil called yeah, something like that, which actually describe the rhythms in the dance, and it's quite amazing because it sounds like just what some people still say today. But other than that, of course, a lot of things have changed. For example, the repertoire that people are familiar with, they actually come from maybe 200 years ago. They were produced by these four brothers known as Tanjore Quartet. Sorry, I don't have it in the picture. But the most important story I want to tell here is that in the 19th century, this dance form used to be called sadi, and it suffered a decline because the British rulers in India saw it as a form of evil. Because, sorry, I'm going to time, I think, speed up a bit. Because they were performed by women known as Deva Dasis, who, Deva means God, like Dasi, like devotees. They were women who were devoted to a god that they don't get married, but they received patronage from, you know, some nobility, and sometimes, you know, they became something like a concubine. And so the British thought that it is a kind of prostitution, plus the fact that the dance could often have like erotic overtones. So they tried to ban this practice. And what happened in the 1930s was something very interesting, because that was at the height of the Indian national movement. And then the people, like, actually one key person who tried to restore respectability to this dance form was E. Krishna Iyer, because he promoted this dance form and he persuaded women of a higher caste of Brahmins to perform it. So nowadays, like South Indian women from this higher caste, you know, do it as a matter of fact, but actually it wasn't always so. And actually, by the way, the name Bharatanatyam came about from that time. So he made it look more. Bharatanatyam is also that some people relate to an older tradition. One interesting thing is, by the way, that the dancing in cinema is actually E. Krishna Iyer. He was cross-dressing at the time. Okay. and of course, Bharatanatyam. Another important point is that Bharatanatyam in Singapore, is it just the Bharatanatyam you see in India? Actually, not really, because Bharatanatyam is a dance form, it's a creative practice. So like every few hundreds of years, of course, people come with new ideas. And so, for example, I'll just show this. It's this picture of a dance production called Rickshaw. It is choreographed by the cultural medallion recipient Chandra Bhaskar, and it is based on the story written by Gopal Kun, the silly tiger and the funny old tree. Okay. So, okay, let's go on. So, I just want to switch to from Indian culture to Chinese culture, and so this Confucian ethics to us seems to be like something that defines the Chinese identity. But how it has been interpreted over the centuries have always been different. And interesting thing about Singapore is that it has used Confucian ethics to epitomize the idea of Asian values. But when did that happen? Actually, most significantly, Confucian ethics was introduced as part of religious studies in the 1980s. And part of the reason can be traced back to the 1970s when there were student movements and labor movements, and the government suddenly decided that this was due to Western influence, right? Anything to do with democracy or human rights as Western influence. So to maintain stability of Singapore, it is necessary to instill Asian values. So we have all these Bible studies or whatever in the 1980s. But then the problem started. What happened in the 80s? Like again, there were people fighting for the rights of workers. And then the government was feeling a bit edgy because anybody remembers what happened in the Philippines? What happened to Marcos? You know, the power of the church. So 1987. I need to say more. Okay, I would just want to say that in fact this revival of Confucianism did not begin in Singapore back with the PAP regime. You can trace it back to. Do you want me to just stop here? Just 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Okay. So actually, part of it was in the late 19th century when the first consul of the Manchurian dynasty was this Meng. He came to Singapore and was instrumental in like promoting Chinese education, and he also promoted Confucian ethics. Okay, so Confucian ethics back then was used as like kind of soft power, just like Confucius Institute from China nowadays, going all around the world. And why were they so interested in bringing Confucian ethics? Because they want to establish ties with the Straits Chinese here. Why so? Because Singapore is important, economically. Okay, so so the importance of Singapore did not start with, the importance of Singapore to China did not start with Deng Xiaoping and Lee Kuan Yew started back. You can trace it back then. And one of the newspapers, Tiannan Xinbao, was also instrumental in promoting Confucian ethics. It was set up by this guy Khoo Sok Ting, who is buried in Bukit Brown. And there's this anecdote I want to tell you, which is like Confucian ethics was not always seen as something positive back then. There was when people like Lim Boon Keng tried to promote it, actually a lot of Chinese merchants were a bit reserved and worried at the time, because at the time this man Kan Wei and others in China were using Confucian ethics to push for reforms, to support the Gongxi emperor against the emperor's dowager. So there's like something really subversive. So Kan Wei became a fugitive in Singapore, and he had to be guarded by those Singapore merchants, and the governor in Singapore protected him, and he actually wrote a poem when he was in Chiang Hong Lim's residence, the guy after whom Hong Kong is named. He used to own a big stretches of land. So, and he actually described himself being guarded by Sikh guards. That's why it's not surprising that you see Sikh guards in the Bukit Brown cemetery, because it was prevalent that day. Poetry, of course, there's this Khoo Seok Wan, who was like a very early Chinese, like a Confucian scholar and Chinese writer, who wrote poems that even incorporated Malay words, and And you can see one of his poems at his grave in Bukit Brown, but unfortunately that's been assumed, so I don't know what's going to happen to the grave, presumably going to be preserved. But. So, so in short, I just want to say that what we assume as unchanging traditions from days of old have actually gone through a lot of changes and different interpretations, and so heritage is not something unchanging, but it is a process of struggle, of contestation in colonial history and beyond. Thank you.